Could I invite those members who are leaving the chamber to please do so quickly and quietly, as we will now move on to the final item of business this evening, and that is the members' business debate on motion 20235 in the name of Craig Hoy on Scotland's flood defences. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Craig Hoy to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As a nation, Scotland is shaped by water. It is central to our landscape, our economy and our identity. The world over, lochs, rivers and long, rocky and rugged coastlines are closely identified with Scotland, as of course, unfortunately, is the rain. However, plentiful water isn't just one of our greatest assets, it is also one of our greatest challenges. And flooding is one of the most acute environmental challenges facing Scotland today. It's an increasing threat to communities across Scotland, both coastal and inland, and the need for effective flood defences have never been more urgent. Flooding in Scotland is not a new problem, but it is becoming more and more frequent and more severe, impacting people, their homes, businesses and critical infrastructure. Scientific projections suggest Scotland can expect wetter, warmer winters in future, along with more extreme weather events. And this will place even greater pressure on existing flood defences, putting homes, businesses, farmland and infrastructure at further and future risk. And across the south of Scotland region that I represent, some advances have been made in developing better flood defences. However, in communities such as Peebles and Walkerburn, there are serious concerns that a continuing lack of flood protection poses a risk to people and property, along with fears that successful funding applications to install schemes in places like Galashiels, Selkirk and Jedburgh mean that there is now little cash left for further defence schemes in the foreseeable future. In East Lothian, for example, in Musselburgh and down the coast, a debate is raging about what sort of flood defences the town and the wider coastline area needs and how much it will cost. In other communities, plans for flood protection have not secured the necessary support of local communities, such as recent proposals for a scheme in Langham. In that instance, plans would have included the erection of walls and embankments along the River Esk and its tributaries, but they were shelved due to strong opposition from within the community, amid fears of spiralling costs. Now, I recognise in many instances the strength of local opinion and want to stress that it must be heeded as ministers and councils across South Scotland consider future flood defence plans. And this is at the heart of what I want to say today. The need to fully consult with local communities, with partners, with businesses, with organisations and other stakeholders during the appraisal and consenting process for flood defence schemes. This is a crucial step, but all too often it has not been the case. The most glaring example of this is the failure to mount a meaningful consultation for the White Sands Flood Defence Scheme in Dumfries, a scheme that was recently given the green light by the SNP-run council. That there is a serious flooding issue at the White Sands is not in dispute. It floods regularly and can cause severe disruption and damage to businesses and other properties in the area when the Nith bursts its banks. Yet, despite this, the proposed scheme, estimated to cost potentially a staggering £69 million and possibly even more, has not won the support of local people among those in neighbouring communities. In fact, Minister, it is quite the opposite. Over recent years, thousands of locals have signed petitions against the scheme, which would fundamentally and damagingly alter historic views along the White Sands, with a raised walkway incorporating walls, glass panels and floodgates planned to run from the former Dumfries and Galloway standard offices downstream to Dock Park, with additional measures over the river at Welldale and Kenmure Terrace. And aside from the physical impact of the proposed scheme, there are also widespread fears locally that it could lead to the loss of the Rood Fair, one of Scotland's longest-running festivals, which dates back to the 1500s, which makes use of the White Sands each year. And there are also very real concerns among local retailers about the disruption and the loss of revenues that their businesses will face during the construction phase. And of course, there is an equally widespread view that this costly scheme will be ineffective. A £69 million white elephant on the River Nith, which siphons off millions of pounds in investment, which could have supported vital local services, including effectively addressing other flood-related issues. The funding could have gone towards tackling the flooding which affects so many roads in the rural South West, or go towards the proper dredging of local rivers. Or it could have helped replace the Diamond Jubilee Bridge and the Cuthbertson Memorial Bridge, both washed away in 2021 when water levels along the River Annan reached a 50-year high. These are practical measures which would command support within the community, rather than see a £69 million project squandered on a flood scheme for Dumfries that locals simply do not have confidence in, Minister. Flood defences are essential to Scotland's future. They protect lives, homes and livelihoods, and they also help ensure communities can thrive despite climate change. But they need to be taken forward with the necessary consultation of local communities, partners, businesses, organisations and other stakeholders, particularly when it is local authority and also Scottish Government money that is at risk. Water has shaped Scotland's history, and with the right choices and the right flood mitigation measures which enjoy public support, it does not have to threaten the future of our country and our communities.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. We now move to the open debate. I call Emma Harper to be followed by Tess White. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I want to thank Craig Hoy for securing this debate. I agree with much of what Craig Hoy has outlined about the need for implementing coastal and inland flood defences. Water has shaped Scotland's history. I'm going to focus my comments in my short time on the recent decision made by Dumfries and Galloway Council regarding the proposed White Sands scheme. People outside watching and listening to Craig Hoy's speech would be forgiven for thinking that the Council suddenly decided last month that it would be a good idea to build a flood protection barrier and come up with some plans on the back of a fag packet, but probably inspired by Mr Hoy's party and their approach to public policy. But the vote by Dumfries and Galloway Council was a culmination of 15 years of planning, design, hydraulics reports, technical reports, planning applications and many, many consultations. I agree that there are people and further afield who are against the flood protection scheme and some who are sceptical but open to persuasion. But it will be a big change for the landscape of the town at the White Sands, and any change on this scale, and it is a substantial project with a substantial budget, will inevitably split opinion. The White Sands has flooded more than 200 times since the 1820s, and worse flooding in recent years has been witnessed. The proposal will provide a permanent 1 in 75-year flood protection standard. But Mr Hoy has spent some time going through the public record on the White Sands. He would find over a decade of consultation, planning submissions, council committee meetings, charrettes, open meetings, information evenings and so on and so on. And I will take an intervention.
Craig Hoy.
Also, however, recognise the scale of local opposition at various stages in the consultation, including in the public inquiry. And isn't it right now that local representatives reflect that public opinion, rather than doing as she's doing, which is selling the community down the river with this expensive, unwanted and deeply unpopular scheme?
Emma Harper.
So, thank Craig Hoy for that intervention. I don't believe I am selling people down the river. I haven't been part of the votes or the decision making. I think the choice that was voted for at the local authority is the choice to move ahead with this, and I'm going to come to some of those points actually. So the outcome of the consultations and the decisions that the majority of elected members supported has had the decision made ahead of recess. We've seen for many years that the Conservatives have had a reluctance to spend public money protecting public good. But I take the view that if we elect representatives to take these decisions, and the Council has decided to do that and move forward, £55 million in Scottish Government funding, I won't take another intervention, £55 million in Scottish Government funding is a huge boost for the local economy. Almost every day we hear lectures from the opposite benches about where spending, our finite spending made more finite by the colleagues' economically crackpot austerity agenda over the years should go. But here we are looking at transformational, major investment in the South West infrastructure, and to be clear, that money is from the Government's flood protection budget. budget, 80%. If Dumfries doesn't spend it on flood protection, another scheme will take its place. Are we seriously suggesting that after 15 years of consideration, consultation, democratic debate and late last year the democratic decision that we should tell the Scottish Government that Dumfries does not want that investment after all? And that economic boost will continue in the longer term, Presiding Officer. Reputationally, how much good does it do for inward investment if the major reason for Dumfries hitting the headlines every year is because the White Sands is underwater? It would be useful if Mr Hoy had a plan for the local businesses and the residents who suffer flooding year after year, and if we had spelled out exactly how long he thinks they should wait and tolerate the disruption in their lives. Should it be 1 more year? Should it be another 5? So I want to see maximum public consultation, absolutely, on any big infrastructure project. The days of far-off officials given an aye or a nay belong in the 1950s. But after 15 years of public consultation on the White Sands, I don't think it's too much to allow decision makers elected by the people to make a decision that might not get 100% approval, but which will transform the lives of people that we need to support in the future of the White Sands in Dumfries. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I call Tess White to be followed by Sarah Boyack. Ms White.
Presiding Officer, more than 2 years have now passed since Storm Babette devastated Brechin. Yet far too many families have still not returned home. What should have been a period of recovery has instead become a case study in delay, deflection and abandonment by this SNP government. 85 council houses were ruined by flooding and may not be rebuilt until 2030 at the earliest. More than 30 privately owned homes were also affected. Empty properties are costing over £6,000 a week lost in rent, while remaining residents feel trapped in uncertainty. And many have told me that every time it rains, they fear this nightmare will begin all over again. That constant anxiety, Presiding Officer, is an often overlooked human cost of inaction. The failure of the Brechin Flood Prevention Scheme should have been a wake-up call. Built just 7 years before it was overwhelmed, it demonstrated that existing defences were not fit for purpose and are not keeping pace with extreme weather. Yet the Scottish Government has failed to properly strengthen or fund Brechin's protections. Ministers were quick to appear for photo opportunities in the aftermath, but far slower to deliver the funding and decisions needed to prevent a repeat. As a result, local government has been left to pick up the pieces. Angus Council wants to rebuild River Street and improve the flood protection, but cannot do so alone. A rebuild has been estimated at £15 million over 30 years, a cost simply beyond the council's means without government support. And this leaves Angus Council in an impossible position, responsible for delivery, but denied the resources to act. The economic damage has just been as stark. Flooding crippled local businesses, none more so than Matrix International. Once employing around 100 people, the company was so badly flooded it was forced to scale back its operations and ultimately closed. The Scottish Government's flood recovery support amounted to just £3,000. Presiding Officer, I hear Emma Harper criticise these opposite benches, but I say to Emma Harper and her colleagues to look at the Audit Scotland's report. It was damning on flooding and resilience, and it confirmed serious gaps in flooding, skills and capacity, and states that the system for allocating flood defence funding is not fit for purpose. Costs are rising, schemes are delayed, and fewer communities are being protected as a result. What has sustained communities like Brechin has not been government strategy, but community spirit. Volunteers, council staff, emergency services and neighbours helping neighbours. But goodwill alone, Presiding Officer, cannot replace leadership. This government should have matched the resilience of communities with real action and proper investment. At-risk communities like Brechin deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms White. I call Sarah Boyack to be followed by Micah Chapman. Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this is an absolutely crucial debate, so I really want to thank Craig Hoy for securing it today, because it's not a distant concern, this issue. It's an immediate and escalating threat to communities right across Scotland. The survey in 2018 that I've been using for the last few years estimated that 284,000 properties in Scotland are at risk of flooding, with projections showing the number rising to almost 400,000 by 2080. But there was a report published by SEPA last month, and it made clear that the risks have escalated. And it stated that communities from the borders to the Highlands and Islands have lived with the impact of flooding for decades, as colleagues have commented. It also quotes, "As our climate changes, the impacts are accelerating. The National Flood Risk Assessment 2025 gives us the clearest picture yet of what lies ahead for Scotland's homes and businesses, and why action to improve Scotland's flood resilience matters." The report states that around 400,000 properties, homes, businesses and vital services are in areas at medium risk of flooding. That's 1 in 8 properties across Scotland, a sharp rise from the 2018 estimate. Now, these are not abstract figures, and we need to find ways to deliver in our communities, because families, businesses, entire communities' safety and livelihoods depend on the decisions that are made. And it's also an issue that the insurance sector is raising with us. They came to lobby us before Christmas. But we're not seeing the strategy in place that's needed to match the urgency of the situation. Funding isn't keeping pace with rising costs, and as projects get delayed, the increasing number of homes and critical infrastructure is now exposed to flood risk. I think what's in the strategy is not sharp enough. It lacks clear timescales and implementation plans that communities deserve now. And without defined timescales, with every delay, the cost rises and communities are impacted. Now, I don't think the draft climate change plan prioritised flooding resilience sufficiently. And as colleagues across... A very brief one.
Cabinet Secretary.
Draft plan might not, but the Scottish National Adaptation Plan, SNAP 3, does. That is where all the adaptation plans do lie, and I'm sure that Sarah Boyack is familiar with that document.
Sarah Boyack.
My point, Cabinet Secretary, is it needs to be way higher up the agenda. So in the climate change plan, it's crucial, because when roads are shut, rail lines are disrupted, communities become isolated, and essential, reliable transport is vital to keep people safe and enable businesses to function. And as comments across the chamber have been made, the intensity of the climate change is impacting on flooding, and it's going to get worse. And that's why we need a comprehensive approach to flood defence. Hard engineering alone will not be enough. And we also need to see investment in nature-based solutions that slow the flow of water before it reaches our towns and villages. That means restoring wetlands, protecting and expanding peatlands, and supporting natural flood management projects that work with the landscape rather than against it. And we also need to accelerate the rollout of sustainable urban drainage systems, both in existing communities and in new developments. And our communities have to be involved in the design of flood investment from the start of the process, not towards the end. And communities need to be involved because it matters to everybody. I've followed the huge interest, the work done in East Lothian, because there is a real risk to people's homes and businesses, and they need confidence that the Scottish Government is going to deliver the scale of protection investment that's required to meet the changing climate people are now experiencing. Presiding Officer, I want to finish. We've known about these challenges for decades. When I was a town planner, literally decades ago, this started to be on our agenda in places like Grangemouth, but you've still not seen the investment. So it's got to be something that we can disagree with each other on all sorts of issues, but we've got to have the political commitment across our parties, because not acting is going to risk people's homes, their businesses, their livelihoods, and decisions made now will determine whether our communities are protected or exposed in the decades ahead. And we owe it to our communities to act with urgency, ambition, involvement involve them in the process, because we need to deliver right across Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyd. I call Maggie Chapman excuse me, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Craig Hoy for securing this debate. At a time when extreme weather is very much on our minds, it's right that we consider how we build resilience in the face of growing uncertainty for many communities. This debate is about safety, it's about justice and community resilience. It's about how we ensure people can live free from the fear and devastation caused by flooding. For too many communities, flooding is not an abstract or future risk, but a lived reality that affects how they sleep, work, insure their homes or plan their futures. Extreme weather events, as we've heard, are no longer rare. They are the new normal, more frequent and severe, driven by the climate crisis that is already here. This is patently clear in the North East, particularly in Angus and Aberdeenshire, where repeated flooding has exposed the consequences of flood defences that are not future-proofed and of policies that are not properly joined up. In Angus, the experiences of residents in Brechin and at Castleton Cottages are a stark warning. One Castleton resident said, "We've done everything we were told to do, but the water keeps coming in. We can't relax when it rains. We're always waiting for the next flood." That constant anxiety takes a serious toll on mental well-being, on family life, and on people's sense of safety in their own homes. These floods were not inevitable. The failure to properly connect land use, land management, planning decisions, and flood defences left communities exposed. When upstream land management, river engineering, housing development, and emergency planning are treated separately and siloed, the result is repeated flooding, rising insurance costs, and people feeling abandoned. In Brechin, where homes have been inundated and defences breached, as Tess White mentioned earlier, a resident has said, "It's not just the damage, it's the stress. Insurance is harder to get, premiums go up and up. Some neighbours just feel trapped." That is not a fair price for people to pay simply for living in their communities. They need action, not just sympathy. And the same pattern is evident in Aberdeenshire. In Stonehaven, Inverurie and elsewhere, communities live with the memory and risk of flooding that damages homes and businesses, erodes lands and threatens vital services. One Inverurie resident said, "The river doesn't just flood houses, it takes away paths, parks, farmland. It changes how the whole town works." That loss of shared spaces matters, especially when those spaces are essential for health, for food production, for community connection. Stonehaven has a long history of flood risk. While recent protection works have brought some relief, we must ensure that flooding infrastructure is fit for the climate era we are now in. This is about people's everyday lives, their well-being, their ability to work, to sleep safely in their homes, to plan for their future. And the climate crisis will only make flooding events more frequent and more intense. Doing nothing or doing the same things again is not an option. Flood defences must focus on prevention as well as protection, and on people as much as infrastructure. That means connecting land use, land management, planning policy, flood defence decisions. It also means genuine community engagement from the start, listening to local knowledge, supporting community networks, and ensuring that when disaster does strike, people have accessible facilities, clear information, and trusted local support. People in Brechin, Inverurie and Stonehaven want to be partners in shaping the resilient strategies that affect their futures. We must deliver that partnership in every community at risk. It also means investing in nature-based solutions, restoring wetlands, reconnected floodplains, tree planting, protected soils, sustainable land management. These alongside engineered defences. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, this is fundamentally about justice. Flood defence policy must be joined up, locally informed and rooted in a simple principle. Everyone deserves to live a safe life in their own community, now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I call Willie Rennie to be followed by Finlay Carson. Mr Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Craig Hoy for bringing this debate. If you'll forgive me, I'll broaden it out, in particular to cover North East Fife, where my direct knowledge on this is borne by the direct experience and engagement I've had with residents, also with landowners and farmers and all the various regulators, and the local authority as well. It's directly from flooding experiences in Cooper in the winter of 2023, but also in Fruchie, in Muchty, in Strath, in Kingskettle, numerous communities up and down the River Eden that have been affected. And I see the really tight financial situation that we're in. I see that these big bang flood prevention schemes are incredibly expensive, and the costs are growing as construction costs grow as well. I see that it's going to be really difficult to get these big, hard engineering projects in every part of the country that is exposed to flooding. So we need an alternative solution, and some of it has been referenced today. Those natural measures that we've talked about might not be the whole answer, but are part of the answer. And there's two things in particular, and I'm grateful to the Minister for having a meeting with myself and Alex Rowley when we talked about water scarcity and flooding, because the two are equally important in some of our communities. But when we had that discussion, there was two areas that I was particularly keen on seeing. One was the river catchment plan, and the second was, to go with that, a grant scheme for landowners to introduce change. And the two must go hand in hand. But my experience from having discussed with farmers is that the AIC scheme, the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, just doesn't cut it when it comes to agricultural land, arable land. The amount of money that you get in return will just not pay for the conversion, for the sacrifice of that land. And North East Fife, the arable land, is very valuable for arable, but also for vegetables and fruit as well. So you're asking, if that is the scheme, the only scheme that's available, you're asking farmers to sacrifice. Now, farmers are people who are embedded in their communities. They understand the dramatic impact on their neighbours of flooding when the water goes into their houses. They want to do everything they possibly can, but they still need to make a living. They still need to make the farm work. And we know that farm incomes struggle at this time. So we need to have an environment scheme that will actually cut it and provide the necessary support in order for them to make that change. And then we're into what kind of change are we looking at. And despite there being numerous discussions in forums like this and conferences all over the country, there is a chasm between what farmers believe works and what many environmental organisations and the regulators believe should happen. We need to close that gap. We need to have an understanding about what is best practice, what can actually work and make a difference to stop the flooding within communities. Because if we carry on as we are, we're just ignoring that gap, and it is a massive gap, then we're going to get no further forward. But we'll just be talking about this forevermore. So my plea to the Minister is to look in practical terms, because every part of the country is different. I know the Eddleston's different from the River Eden. It's different from the Tweed. It's different from the rivers down in Dumfries. All of them require a bespoke plan for their community. So my plea is to have a grant scheme that works, that makes it possible for farmers to make changes, and also a closing of the gap through a river catchment plan supported by government agencies to make that work. Then we might have a chance of getting some of these natural environment measures to work.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. And I call Finlay Carson. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Climate change is not a distant threat. Our coastal and rural communities already feel the pressure. Heavier rainfall, frequent storms and volatile rivers. My constituency of Galloway and West Dumfries knows this reality all too well. Newton Stewart endured damaging floods, notably in 2015, and Dumfries sees the White Sand submerged annually. Flood protection is essential. I do not oppose flood protection. I only oppose purely managed flood protection. And on that basis, let me make it clear from the outset that I, like many people across Dumfries and Galloway, unlike the representation or the misrepresentation from Emma Harper, they oppose their current Newton Stewart and Dumfries White Sands flood schemes. In May 2023, Dumfries and Galloway Council published its Newton Stewart Flood Protection Scheme, promising a 1 in 200 standard for around 280 properties. That sounds reassuring, but publication triggered 58 objections, many from fisheries interest groups and environmental groups. The River Cree District Salmon Fishery Board was excluded from the environmental impact assessment screening, a statutory duty officers failed to meet. This negligence forced Scottish Government intervention, appointing an independent reporter and requiring additional ecological survey and scour modelling. As a result, the EIA process will not conclude until late in summer 2026. In the White Sands, after a decade, a public petition against the scheme led by David Slater, now Councillor Slater, attracted well over 10,000 signatures. There's been a public local inquiry and ministerial confirmation in 2020. The Council, despite significant local opposition, has struggled to decide whether to proceed. In October 2023, a far from convincing knife-edge vote of 22 to 21 kept the eye-wateringly expensive scheme alive without significant public support. And while Labour and SNP administrations put party politics ahead of public opinion, costs spiralled from £37.5 million in 2023 to £68.6 million by December 2025. That doubling demands hard questions about scope, control, risk management and officer accountability. These delays are a direct result of poor governance. The SNP administration and previous Labour administrations have ignored repeated warnings from residents, businesses and Fisheries Board. They have treated consultation as a tick-box exercise, not a genuine dialogue. Governance is about listening, not imposing. On this test, the SNP administration has failed. Consultation is not a bureaucratic hurdle, it is the foundation of good decision-making. Yet in Newton Stewart, consultation failures have pushed the processes back into 2026. In Dumfries, repeated changes and ballooning costs have eroded trust. People feel decisions are being imposed, not co-designed. So where do we go from here? Well, in Dumfries, there should have been a plain English comparison of all options considered since 2012, when, incidentally, the flood prevention bond was estimated to be a cost of £4 million. It should have shown costs, benefits, environmental impacts and operational standards and explained why each alternative was rejected. Right now, we need to scrap the current scheme and develop a new approach with a locked scope, publish a published risk register and report monthly on cost movements against baseline. And there should be no more exempt items or meetings where the public are excluded. With regards to the Cree, the Council needs to commit to an enforceable timetable for completing the EIA, holding the hearing and, subject to outcome, starting enabling works. We need to ensure genuine consultation, engage fisheries interests, businesses and residents before finalising designs, not after objections appear in the final stages. And critically, improved officer accountability. Neglecting statutory duties, issuing notices months late and reacting only under reporters' pressure is unacceptable. A balanced approach should underpin every scheme, looking beyond concrete and glass to natural flood prevention, as Willie Rennie has touched on, tree planting, restoring wetlands, reconnecting floodplains, sustainable land management and a pragmatic consideration for dredging, and fair compensation for landowners. Hard engineering alone will not solve flooding problems on either the Nith or the Cree. Presiding Officer, climate resilience requires competence. Dumfries and Galloway Council have had years to get these schemes right. Their communities deserve flood defences that protect them from the next storm, not defences that drown them with uncertainty. I believe in local democracy, decision-making and accountability. But today, given the failures in Dumfries and Galloway, I call on the Scottish Government to insist on tighter assurances for local schemes receiving national funding. And I call on Dumfries and Galloway Council and the SNP administration, backed by Labour councillors, to stop blaming inflation and start demonstrating control on consultation, on cost and on delivery timelines. Presiding Officer, the next storm will not wait for excuses. It will not wait for another committee meeting. Our communities need action, competent, transparent and accountable action now. Anything less is a betrayal of public trust.
Thank you, Mr Carson. We now move to the winding up by the Cabinet Secretary, Gillian Martin. Round 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I've listened carefully to contributions this evening, and I think this type of debate is very important, and I congratulate Craig Hoy for securing it, because often I have flooding policy, national policy associated with flooding, but it's very important that I hear the feedback about particular local considerations, although I do not want to insert myself into decisions that local councillors make, because I think it's only right that they do make those decisions on what they do for their communities. But it's very, very important. If you give me a second just to get going. I think it's very important that in the round, although the final decisions are obviously made by councils, that in terms of when we talk about flooding strategy and anything we're doing in the strategic place, that Scottish Government ministers of any flavour have an ability to hear back from around the country as to where things haven't worked, are not working, or need a fresh look. And I'll take
Craig Hoy.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Given that in this particular instance in relation to the White Sands, that the majority of local residents think the Council has made the wrong decision and ultimately is the Scottish Government that will be committing taxpayers' money to this project, what interventions can the Government take to make sure this money is spent properly if it is to proceed, or perhaps to do the right thing and to step back and remove funding for this and direct those scarce resources towards other flood defence mechanisms?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Craig Hoy heard me, but I prefaced my remark there saying I am not going to insert myself into local decision making. And I think that we have to talk about, we're having a members' debate about flooding, not just about one particular flooding project that is particular to Mr Hoy's region, but about a lot of areas, and a lot of really important comments about the importance of having flooding and the impact of it and the mitigations and protections against it talked about in the round. The science is clear. Climate change means that we are facing record weather extremes, and that includes increased risks of heavy rainfall, more intense storm events and flooding. Sarah Boyack mentioned the report that came out, SEPA's figures. Could I just make some points first about the general premise of this debate? SEPA's published figures also reframed it in 1 in 8 properties in Scotland are now at risk of flooding. That is sobering. That is a sobering statistic, and it's something we need to take very... And it highlights the importance. And I did mention the Scottish National Adaptation Plan, and I'll go on to talk about flooding resilience strategies as well. But it highlights that it's not just the climate change plan. The climate change plan is about emissions reduction, whatever. It's important that all members know about the Scottish National Adaptation Plan, or SNAP 3, because that is a vehicle in which it is rolled out throughout all agencies across Scotland, all councils across Scotland, and provide a blueprint for action. I'll take Oliver Mundell.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention, and I'm not trying to draw into individual schemes. But my question is, given the points Willie Rennie's made and others have made round the change in the weather, this wider system thinking, looking at whole river catchments, does it not concern the Minister in relation to schemes in general that have existed for a long time, been kicking about, going through all these processes, that the schemes themselves haven't actually adapted to the change in the weather, change in thinking, and aren't looking at that broader picture, and money is going to be spent on those and they might not be effective?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, without actually talking about any particular schemes, I think the point is that there's, and a number of members made this point, and I actually can quote Finlay Carson, who actually was in agreement with what the part of his speech that said hard engineering projects alone will not solve flooding. It has to be a range of interventions, and the interventions that are made all have to have a cumulative effect and have a complementary effect as well. Willie Rennie mentioned about natural flood prevention, or indeed using green space for the sort of double purpose. I've been at a couple of these interventions that have been made around the country, about one in Inverness a few years ago. I think I actually was with Finlay Carson, by day and by most of the year, a football pitch, but in a flooding event, a reservoir for taking floodwater. Inverleith Park is another fantastic example. Again, by day and most of the year, it's a beautiful community garden and a space for people to enjoy recreation, but it also serves to take floodwaters from Edinburgh in the event. And we've had previous flood protection schemes, and Tess White mentioned Brechin. Of course, Brechin had a flood protection scheme with £13 million of Scottish Government investment, but that was not able to withstand Storm Babette, which was not the level of impact of the flooding waters of Storm Babette overtop the flood prevention and breaches. So you've always got to have this adaptive process when you're talking about flooding, and you have to be able to build for beyond what might be seen as like a 1-in-100-year event. Because, I mean, I remember Storm Frank very well in my constituency, and Maggie Chapman alluded to some of the damage that was done to Inverurie, which is in my constituency. And we were told that was a 1-in-100-year event. But we're seeing flooding events of this nature in Scotland every year, practically every year as well. I want to mention some of the things. We have allocated £570 million to local authorities for flood protection schemes and flood resilience, and we've delivered, throughout the country there has been 21 flood protection schemes delivered so far. There's also been an additional £11.7 million to local authorities since 2022 to support coastal change adaptation as well, because of course flooding doesn't just come from rainfall, it can come from the impact of coastal erosion in those coastal areas in particular. People have mentioned Stonehaven. I think Maggie Chapman might have mentioned Stonehaven, who have recently in the last few years had their coastal resilience upgraded. I've listened to all the concerns today. I will continue to listen to all these concerns. I think it's important that ministers don't involve themselves in local decision making as much as possible. I agree with Emma Harper in their general point. We elect councillors to make these decisions, and it's up to councillors to listen to the local community and to be able to discuss and consult with the local community to see what is best. I'll take Sarah Boyack.
Sarah Boyack.
I appreciate the member taking intervention. SEPA estimate that £500 million is the cost of flooding every year in Scotland at the moment. So what more could the Scottish Government do to support local authorities to make sure that lessons are learned and that we have the skills and expertise in every single community across Scotland so we get the action our constituents need?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think there's a number of things. So obviously, we've got the Flood Risk Management Act laid out statutory obligations for local authorities as well. But I want to point to, if I may, the discussion that Willie Rennie and Alec Rowley and I had about adaptation. That was just before Christmas. And just today, Willie Rennie, I hope will be pleased to hear that I had a very comprehensive discussion with a Chief Scientific Advisor for Natural Resources and Agriculture. And they're actually working at the moment on formalised partnership working groups between our agencies like SEPA, Scottish Government and the farming community along a range of water courses. It's actually work that I'm actually very excited about. And I think we've also got the river partnerships as well. We've got the pilots in the Dee. There's one in the Dee near my constituency, not on my constituency. It's Alexander Burnett's constituency largely that has the Dee in it. And you have working with like river trusts, for example, and working with land managers and farmers and agencies, and all working as almost a project team. And I think that's very important because everyone has got expertise and everyone has knowledge about their own areas, and it's very important that we harness that. So that with the engagement of communities in flood protection measures, the Flood Risk Management Act lays out clear statutory obligations for local authorities, but of course we need to be adaptive as communities, and we need to be listening to all the members of the communities where they have ideas on how things can be managed better. I'll take Rachel Hamilton and I'll probably have to close.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank Gillian Martin for taking the intervention. As Gillian Martin will be aware, Newcastleton has not yet had flood defences built, but it is a huge risk, 140 houses, and it actually puts people off living in the area. Once they're moved out, they will not move back. They're too scared. And it's an elderly population and a rural population. Does Gillian Martin believe that there is a societal impact that needs to be considered here and a community aspect as well as an impact on rural areas rather than just the safety aspect?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think there's safety aspects. There's exactly what Rachel, there's a psychological impact on communities. I have constituents in Methlick, Ellen, Inverurie, who were taken out of their homes at 3 in the morning on the 7th of January. Actually, this is the anniversary in 2016, who still have the lasting psychological scars from losing all their possessions and been woken up thinking that, not knowing whether or not they were going to make it out of their house. So I think we have to take that into account, but we also have to look at the massive societal cost in the round and the economic cost as well. If we don't put flood prevention in place, then the cost of dealing with a flood event is vastly outweighs the actual cost of putting those preventions in the first place. And that's why I would encourage everyone to look to support where they can the interventions that get made, and also not prevaricate on them, to get them built and get them made, because the funding is available. And obviously, I hear from Rachel Hamilton that she's talking about Castleton, I believe. Newcastleton, sorry. And they clearly, according to Rachel Hamilton, want some flood defences. So I will leave it there because I am moving well past time, presiding officer, but I have heard everything that people have mentioned. I do, however, think that it is for local councillors, and it's only right that those decisions are made locally as much as possible. But in the wider points that have been made, I have been listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting.